Jody. Okay, if we can move back to our seats. Folks, we're going to go ahead and begin. I want New America Foundation staff to please encourage people to move to their seats or move into the foyer. And that means now. Okay. Without further ado, we're going to begin. I see a lot of folks still standing in the back, but please join us. And I want to again thank our C-SPAN audience for joining us today. We have with us a very distinguished panel, and the way this will happen is that Desmond Laughlin, Resident Fellow of the American Enterprise Institute and former Managing Director of Salomon Smith Barney, is going to launch off with a PowerPoint presentation. Simon Richmond has already referred in advance to it and to Desmond, which is great. And we're going to be followed by Joel Kotkin, Senior Fellow of the New America Foundation, author of The City, A Global History and the New Geography, also an author of one of our reports that we're distributing and which is available on the New America Foundation website at www.newamerica.net. Bernard Schwartz, Chairman and CEO of BLS Investments and Chairman of the Board of Third Way, also co-author with Cheryl Schweninger, who will also be up here, of Public Investment Works in the latest issue of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas, and Janet Kavanoky, Director of the Transportation Infrastructure Project in the Congressional Public Affairs Division at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's very interesting that Tom Donahue, the President of the Chamber of Commerce, has been writing quite a bit lately about public infrastructure issues as well. And finally, as I mentioned, Cheryl Schweninger, who heads our Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation. They will be joining us after Desmond Lachman's talk here. And so without further ado, please welcome Desmond Lachman.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to share my views on the current situation. At this stage, what I want to be doing is trying to give a diagnosis of the situation and indicate what sort of financial policies might be needed to address it. I'm not known for not being clear and straightforward with my views, so let me start right at the outset, to distinguish myself from the panel that went before, and I'd say that this has to be one of the most serious situations from a macroeconomic point of view that I've seen in my career, and it's very much not a United States problem alone, but it's rather a global problem. And I was very glad to see that one doesn't really have to have a PhD in economics to realize that this isn't just a housing problem, but we're talking about a major credit bubble that is in the process of being unwound. I think it's very important that we diagnose the problem correctly so that we get the right kind of policy prescription. And I'm afraid that just observing the Federal Reserve the last couple of years has to lead to a great degree of disappointment. First, they didn't realize that they were contributing to an enormous bubble. They did nothing to stop that bubble. When that bubble burst, they've been very slow in reacting. In fact, it took Ben Bernanke till something like August this year to realize that not only was there bursting of a bubble, but there was a credit crunch of major proportion. Let me indicate more clearly why it is that I have grave concern about the current situation. Is that I think that we have a situation here in the United States where the economy is being hit simultaneously by three major shocks. The first is a housing price bubble deflation, the likes of which we haven't seen in the post-war period. We'd really have to go back, as one of the speakers mentioned, to the 1930s to see house prices declining at a national basis. The second is that we've got a major credit crunch that is worse, very much worse than what we had in the long-term credit management, capital management crisis of 1998. The third is that we've got oil prices at very elevated levels. If those three shocks aren't enough, we've now got a stock market that is beginning to falter, that wealth is being destroyed in the stock market, and we look as if we're on the cusp of a dollar crisis. What we've been seeing since August is that the dollar has been decelerating at depreciating at an accelerating rate, people losing confidence in the dollar, both because of the state of the U.S. economy, what they're anticipating, and because of the mess in the United States financial system. I'd like to just elaborate on a couple of these points by referring to a chart. The one chart that I really would want to emphasize is the next chart. This is the Shiller chart of house prices in the United States over the past 100 years. I'm going to forget about before the Second World War, but if you take a look at this chart, what you see is truly spectacular, is that in the post-war period when we had a typical housing boom and bust, the worst that would happen is that house prices would increase by 20%, and these are adjusted for inflation, so these are real house prices. We'd get a bubble of 20%, and then we'd get the bust, and many of those busts led to recessions. This, we're talking about an 80% increase in house prices, practically a doubling of house price in real terms at the national level. So this isn't something that is minor. You've really got to expect a major correction. If you look at the next chart, this is the second chart that I would suggest is really important, in that this looks at United States house prices in relation to income. Over about a 20-30 year period, the line is practically flat. House prices were roughly 3.2 times income in the United States. If we look at where we've got to now, we're looking at something like 4.5 times. So it doesn't surprise me at all that Goldman Sachs, for instance, is now talking about house prices over the course of this downturn, which will take several years, will correct by 15 to 30%. People might dismiss this as saying that housing only constitutes 5% of the U.S. economy, what big a deal is. But the real big deal is that we're destroying wealth to the tune, if this does occur, there's something like $21 trillion worth of housing stock. If you take 20% of that, we're talking about $4 trillion destruction of wealth, which certainly is going to have a bearing on consumption expenditure. And I'm going to come to the point shortly, is it's going to really complicate the credit crunch that is already going on. If we just go to the next slide, just shows that house prices already are falling. Case-Shiller is showing that that's falling at something like 6%. And a different way that one can look at it is just ask oneself, what is the state of the housing market in the United States right now? It's characterized by excess supply. Whatever you look at, whether it's inventories of unsold houses, whether it's vacancy rates, we're in uncharted territory. We're really at record levels on those indicators of excess capacity. But then if we ask ourselves, what is going to happen to demand and supply going forward? Well, most of the subprime lending and Alt-A lending, that was something like 40% of financing of houses, well, that's not going to take place, so we don't have financing occurring. We've got lending standards in the banks being tightened abruptly. And then if we go to the next slide, we've got, this is the mortgage resets that are occurring, adjustable rate mortgages. That the first month is the first month of this year. So we're moving into the period where those are going to peak. Over the next 18 months, you've got $800 billion of mortgage resets. These were done at teaser rates, which people could barely afford. So as they reset, we really are going to be getting increased defaults. Estimates are something like there'll be 2 million foreclosures next year. And this is the reason why we're reading about some attempt by Treasury to get a workout to prevent all of that damage. A problem with the resets, if we go to the next slide, is that this slide just shows that there was a deterioration of lending standards. And this is the rate of delinquencies on loans of particular vintage. What you see in the line on the far left is that is 2006. Loans subprime loans made in 2006 are in delinquency practically as the loan is written. So what we're going to be seeing now is the adjustable rate mortgages as they reset in 2008. Those will be on the 2006 vintage, so the losses are going to be very high. That brings me to the issue of the credit crunch. If we go to the next slide, please. The credit crunch, we can talk about it loosely, but I think that we've got to get some quantification of how important is the credit crunch. Ben Bernanke at the beginning of the year, when he told us that there was a subprime issue, it wasn't a big deal. A little bit later, he said, well, maybe it's a problem of $50 billion to $100 billion. His latest estimate, testimony about a week or two ago, he says, well, a figure of something like $150 billion is in the ballpark. Meanwhile, on Wall Street, we've got people like Joseph Ackerman, head of Deutsche Bank, who doesn't have an interest in exaggerating what the problem is. He's talking about $250 billion. There are analysts on the street at Deutsche talking about $400 billion on the subprime problem. An important point was made this morning. 200 or 400 billion isn't a very large sum in relation to the United States economy. The problem is that we don't know where those losses are, which is causing banks to be very scared about lending to one another. They don't know who is really saddled with the big loss, and this is the reason that you're seeing the financial markets freezing up right now. A point that I think is important to stress is not only is this not only a subprime problem, it's clearly not only a subprime problem. There's a housing bust that has got big consequences, but there's been a credit bubble. Lending standards overall were loosened in a remarkable way. So what we've got waiting to occur is the same sort of problems that we're seeing in the subprime mortgages, we're going to be seeing in subprime credit cards, subprime auto loans, home equity loans. There were a lot of junk bonds, something like just a mere trillion junk bonds were lent at rates that clearly implied a very much lower probability of default than the historic probability of default. So we know that there are going to be losses all round. Estimates by Goldman Sachs that came out last week suggest that putting aside the $200 to $400 billion on the subprime case, we might have the same sort of numbers in other lending. So it's little wonder that the financial system is clogged up. If we go to the next slide, this slide just shows what's happening in asset-backed commercial paper. This is really a run on the bank's off-balance sheet activities, meaning that the banks are going to have to bring stuff back onto their balance sheets, which means that they're not going to be too excited about making new loans. And once again, I think that this is an incredible oversight by the Federal Reserve to allow off-balance sheet activity to be occurring at the rate that it did. You know, that, for instance, in structured investment vehicles, we've got something like $400 billion, which is a real problem. If we go to the next slide, please. This slide is just showing you one of the measures of the credit crunch, and it's just looking, the green line is the LTCM, that was the 1998 credit crunch, and these are just in terms of days, and you see the green line, situation stabilized rather quickly. What the blue line is showing is the current credit crunch. We had a peak in August. That's when things were really very intense. Everybody said, oh, well, it's going to blow over. This is just a liquidity problem. You know, the Fed pumps in enough money, opens the discount window, everything's going to go back. Well, this chart isn't updated as it should be, but we're back to the peaks of August. You know, and that's the reason that Bernanke and Cohen are now talking about or intimating that December the 11th will be when they're going to be cutting interest rates again, and hopefully they can last till December the 11th. If we go just to the next slide. This slide just dramatically shows the tightening of lending standards. You know, we're already back. This is a Federal Reserve questionnaire. They ask officers at institutions, how do they feel about lending? And we see that they're not too keen about making mortgage loans in general. And if we go to the next slide, this just shows that the problem is a global problem, because we parked a lot of the toxic paper globally. So the same problem that we've got in the United States, they've got in Europe elsewhere. So we're getting a tightening of lending standards. I think that it's very important, as I might have mentioned at the start, that we learn the lessons from the Japanese as to how to deal with a situation like that. And I would venture to say that what one really needs is very aggressive policies on monetary policy easing. And secondly, one really needs to facilitate the process of repricing of risk, that it doesn't serve the long-run interests of the country to have banks not recognize their losses, not be more transparent in their transactions, because that will just mean that we'll have very little lending, as Japan had for a lost decade, during the 1990s. If we go into, I want now just to talk a little bit about monetary policy. I've mentioned that what we really need to do is have a very much more aggressive easing of policy, do something about the transparency. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to talk, though, about monetary policy not being that straightforward because we've got real constraints on monetary policy right now. And I'd list them in two groups. The one group deals with the inflationary threat, that currently what we've got is we've got oil prices at, they've dropped a little bit below $90 a barrel, but we're really at very high oil prices and food prices, which is feeding inflation. The other, if you go to the next slide, that's the oil price chart, that you can see that oil prices are pretty high. And you go to the next chart, please. This is really the dollar's fate over the last 5 years. What is scary about this chart isn't that we've been in a downward trend on the dollar. That is healthy. That is part of the adjustment process. But it's rather what occurs after August is that the dollar looks like it's a little bit in free fall. And it doesn't really surprise me if foreigners are anticipating that the U.S. economy's got problems, Fed's going to be reducing interest rates, and the financial system, the assets that you bought weren't what you thought they were. You're stuck with $3.5 trillion of assets. Maybe it's not a good idea to add to that. And that gives rise to the problem of, next slide, of financing a current account deficit, which is improving, but it's a mere $800 billion a day. Sorry, $800 billion. I don't want to exaggerate the case. $800 billion a year. Roughly, we just need foreigners to finance us on a net basis by $2 billion a day. And they might have reservations about doing this after making losses on their loans. I just want to address the inflation issue because I think that when I look at the shocks that the U.S. economy is subjected to, the tidal wave that waits ahead of us is, it seems to me that it's going to be very difficult for the United States to avoid a recession going forward. In a recession, what one would expect is commodity prices to come off, if you had a global recession, but more importantly, that the slack that would be generated in the economy would be giving rise to wage pressures diminishing, price pressures, pricing power diminishing, and I think that that would swamp the effect from the from higher oil prices or from a weaker dollar. I don't think that the Fed has got any alternative but to move very aggressively on interest rates. What I would say, though, is there's a need for coordination, global coordination of policies here, because we're in a rather absurd situation in which the dollar is declining, the Fed is talking about reducing interest rates to address its problem, and the Europeans, in their infinite wisdom, are talking about raising interest rates. So little wonder that the euro is moving at a very high rate. The problem, if the Fed is looking too much in the rearview mirror, I think that that's the only thing that the Europeans look at, that they really don't see, that they're being subjected to very much of the same kind of shocks that we've got in the United States. Let me just finish by saying that there are longer run problems that financial policy needs to address. I think that financial policy has got plenty to deal with in the short run. You know, what is very important is to prevent this. If there's anything that we can learn from the Japanese, that if this is not addressed in a recession, credit conditions are going to get worsened, that you're going to have larger losses within the system. You can really spiral into something that is very nasty. And I think that the Fed is finally waking up, smelling the coffee, seeing this, providing a lot of liquidity through the discount window, now beginning to cut interest rates aggressively. I think that they've really got to do that. Longer run, what we really have to do is ask ourselves, how did we get into this mess? And I think that the answer to that is rather complex, but there are issues that there was not proper regulatory oversight. Non-bank originators originated something like half of the mortgages. I'm not sure what the Fed was doing, as $1.3 trillion of credit that they had to know could not possibly be paid, why they weren't stopping that occurring. What we do have to do is the securitization has to have, there's got to be a certain amount of rules. You've got to have a lot more transparency that we had before. Transparency is already a very important problem. And I think that on the originate to distribute model, that is really at the heart of this housing problem, is that in the old days, a bank would make a loan, would stay with the loan for the 30 years. The bank had every incentive to know that that loan was going to perform. They would only make the loan if they thought it was good. We shifted through securitization to a model where we had mortgage originators originating the loan. They didn't particularly care how the loan performed after they had sold it, and they managed to sell it in a very short period of time. My proposal would be that we only have properly capitalized institutions originating mortgages, and a requirement that they hold a small proportion of their mortgages. I guess I just can't resist making one person referred to Rome in the 3rd century AD. I think that when I go around giving this kind of talk, I can very much understand how Jeremiah must have felt, you know, even though his vision was clear.
Desmond, thank you very much. Thank you. If I can ask you to join us up here, and if I can ask Sam to wire Bernard Schwartz immediately in the front, Cheryl Schweninger, Joel Kotkin, and Janet Kavanoki, if you can bring it. Bernard, if I can have you come up immediately, that would be great. Thank you. Terrific, so we can begin our discussion. Really, I think that Desmond Lockman did a wonderful job of helping to give us even greater explication of the concerns and situation about the housing bubble. Cheryl, if I can get you on stage, that'd be great. And then to ask ourselves a question about public infrastructure investment, and given these circumstances, what role ought that to have? So if you can get wired right away. Okay, folks. So we've got a great group with us. Desmond, thank you very much for helping to set a stage. Someone said we should move. I think it was Zach Karabell said we need to move beyond this binary approach to pessimism or optimism. I'm trying just to tell him, but I think that what we'd like to do now is I'd like to ask Bernard Schwartz to lead off in his commentary about how he sees the stage, and also about this question that we said is the reason we're having this particular panel, which is what role for public investment and federal action, Fed action, in restoring growth? Is it an arena that we ought to look to from your perspective?
Absolutely. I think the argument that we heard this morning, which was very valuable and had many insights into our current situation and what the issues are from the point of view of vulnerability and risk to our economy, is very, very important, and we should continue to get insight into the long-term and even the medium-term effect of the current situation. The discussion about infrastructure, however, is more of a tactical nature of what do you do on the interim basis before you resolve the long-term issues of the world's economy. And I think in that respect, the United States has done a very poor job. The increasing deficit of infrastructure investment in this country continues to have an extraordinary impact. The discussion about infrastructure investment has gone on for a very long time, but only recently has gotten impetus because of the recognition that our highways are in terrible shape. The air traffic control system in this country is in terrible shape. We do not have a high-speed rail system that would take care of some of the problems having to do with carbon dissemination and with productivity loss of travel around the country, and so on and so on. But that's part of a larger argument that has to do with what does society do to keep its resources in good shape and competitive in the world. And we have not been doing a good job with respect to that. The other issues that one might raise is education and the rationalization or the improvement of our healthcare system, and doing something about the impact that those now negative, they're not really negative, they're positive on whole, but from a competitive point of view, what do we do about bringing those investments up to a par? Bob Hormats, as someone you may know, called me from China last week in the middle of the night because he was so excited. He said,
just for the audience who's watching, Bob Hormats is the vice chairman of Goldman Sachs.
Yes, he is the international vice chairman of Goldman Sachs. He's a friend, and he called me as a friend. He said the ride from Kennedy Airport, from Midtown to Kennedy Airport, as compared to the ride from the Chongqing, Beijing airport to downtown Beijing, is really interesting because after comparing both, you wonder which is the third world nation. We have done a poor job, and it's not only in terms of the quality of life, it has done a very damaging impact to the productivity and the competitiveness of the United States in a global environment. I have a great deal of respect for the vulnerabilities, the discussion about the vulnerabilities of our economy. But I think it does not address, that discussion does not address what we have to do now and we should have been doing for the last decade in terms of infrastructure investment. And apparently this is a conversation that is gaining more and more attention in the Congress and outside the Congress. People are beginning to realize that this is an idea whose time has come. When you hear the horrendous impact on the efficiency of air traffic control, you will want to take the railroad from now on. Because air traffic control continues to be not only inefficient, unproductive, it's becoming more and more dangerous. Now, I'm not trying to alarm you. What I am saying is that when you recognize that we have not put any money into air traffic control or building runways over the last 15 or 20 years, but that air traffic will continue to grow at 5% a year, you recognize that this is a system that's not getting better. Why infrastructure? Why not investment in education, which we all know needs so much help in this country? Why not health insurance reform? The reason I personally single out infrastructure is because it is politically and financially doable now. I know there's a problem in education. I don't know what the solution is to education. And we do not have a consensus in this country of how to resolve that issue. And we will have. Eventually we'll recognize that we have to have a solution, even if it's only an incremental one, in order to lessen the momentum toward having a society in this country that's very much divided. We're going to have to do something about that. Why don't we address that first rather than infrastructure? My suggestion to you is that infrastructure is doable. A program that allows the United States government to jumpstart investments into infrastructure that would be done in partnership with financial institutions on Wall Street issuing 40 to 50-year bonds with a jump start from the United States government in terms of a guarantee of 20% of the expenditure. This is certainly within the normal format of what financing structure has been forever in this country. And implemented by the private sector seems to me a mechanism that is not brand new. We're not inventing the wheel here. We're recognizing that this has worked before many, many times in our country's history, and take advantage of that, but we need federal leadership. This is not the first time that the United States has depended on executive leadership, the executive branch leadership, in order to help our infrastructure investment. Since 1803, with the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, through the land-grant colleges, the Transcontinental Railway, rural electrification, water resource control in this country, the federal government has taken the lead, and usually financially, and allowed the other elements of the society, financial communities, private sector, and local regions to manage to do the job. And finally, I would say that there is some recognition politically that this might be doable. This past session in the Senate, Senator Dodd and Senator Hagel introduced the Dodd-Hagel bill, which establishes a bank, an infrastructure bank, which allows for the issuing of credits, guarantees on the part of the United States, not outlays, but guarantees, a paper transaction. Although it increases the debt, it really does not increase outlays, and allows the investments to be made around the country to generate new jobs, more payroll. Earlier, one of the panel members said that it's folly to believe that an investment in infrastructure is going to pay for itself moving forward. I totally disagree with it. It depends what your accounting is. If you take into consideration the investment in human resources, in job creation, in new payrolls that are going to be by way of the new productivity and the new capital investment execution, the new job creation, those things will be very immediately felt. Within 1 or 2 years, you can manage that. So I suggest that we have the opportunity to address this issue, and I'd be interested to know what the other panel members have to say about that.
You know, I want to go to Cheryl next, but later something I want to think about, because Desmond raised this very interesting graph a moment ago about a capital crunch, credit crunch between banks lending to banks. And frankly, what it does is it limits your ability to get an echo effect or a multiplier out of financial activity. And one of the comments we had at dinner last night that Bernard shared is what the financial markets could do with government initiated efforts in certain areas, and looking at the levels of multiplier you could get in a normal finance situation, and how that fits. So I'm going to come back later to that. But let me invite Cheryl Schweninger to offer his thoughts.
Thank you. Let me begin by complimenting Desmond for his very insightful presentation. I found it very useful. If you're a regular reader of the Financial Times, every 2 or 3 weeks you'll find some very valuable pearls of wisdom usually in the letters columns, and usually they're signed by Desmond Lackman. I think I've learned more from this individual by reading the Financial Times letters, and I just wanted to have a public opportunity to express that gratitude for you. I think Bernard is on to something very important here, and I think where I wanted to pick up from Desmond's contribution was that while I agree with many of his important recommendations on monetary policy and getting out ahead of this credit crisis, which can take on additional dimensions that we have not seen yet, I believe also, however, that there has to be a fiscal policy response to complement it, particularly in terms of complementing it in terms of the impact on the real economy, and to avoid repeating some of the mistakes we have repeated in the past, where we've used asymmetrical monetary easing, which only created another distortion in investment by creating another asset bubble. In fact, I think the silver lining of this particular crisis, if you can find a silver lining, and there's a lot of pain and damage and a lot of worry about the contractionary effects that this will create and the impact it will have on lives of millions of Americans and indeed perhaps throughout the world, is that it's a necessary correction to what had become a bubble economy in which too much money was going into housing. U.S. economic growth was too dependent on housing and consumption related to the wealth effects of housing. U.S. consumption, in turn, was too much responsible for driving the world economy, or the world economic growth is too dependent on U.S. economic growth, as demonstrated by the increase of the U.S. current account deficit, even in Zach's world, where these things national borders don't matter as much. And so the world was too dependent on U.S. consumption that was built on both debt financing and asset inflation. This allows us, this adjustment, if we're smart about it, if we have the right policy framework, allows us to move the economy on actually a more optimal and a sustainable path, a more balanced path of economic growth for the future, one that is built on more capital investment, both public and private, where wage and income growth drive consumption as much as wealth effects of assets, and where we have better balance globally, where rising living standards and emerging economies and increasing consumption help drive demand for U.S. goods and services. So we should see this, through all the pain, we should see this also as an opportunity, much in the way I think Jamie Galbraith outlined it initially. Now, my basic point is that if we are now beginning to see the first positive leg of the adjustment, I think, in the U.S., in the increase in U.S. exports, which, as David Hale pointed out, have grown 14% in each of the last 2 or 3 months, and has contributed net demand and net growth to the U.S. economy, largely offsetting the fall off in housing. Interestingly, the weaker dollar, which has helped in this regard, I think will have actually another longer-term beneficial effect if it plays out with regard to some adjustment in the exchange rates of the Asian surplus economies as well. Because what will happen is that this will force, a weaker dollar will force the Asian exporters to cut their profit margins, which means that prices to the U.S. consumer will not increase all that much. But it also means that the excess savings that Martin Wolf, I think one of Martin Wolf's most of the Financial Times interesting contributions to this debate, has shown that the Eurasia savings glut has originated from enormous corporate savings, corporate profits in Japan and China. So in some ways, this reduces the producer's power in China and Japan, elevates the consumer powers, and hopefully can stimulate the trends for greater consumption in those economies, which will increase demand for U.S. goods and services. Turning more to domestic macroeconomic policy, again, my basic point is that we need to have a fiscal policy that complements the monetary policy, partly for the reasons the previous panel says. There will be limitations to how effective monetary policy is, particularly in restoring investment, when corporations already enjoy historically low interest rates and are sitting on tons of cash. It will help some consumers, hopefully by reducing some of the interest rate charges, but there will be limitations. As important as the Fed's targeted efforts to unclog the credit and capital markets and perhaps even help recapitalize parts of the financial system, there will be limitations of lower interest rates generally in order to stimulate the real economy. And even if it does, again, the worry is that you have a one-legged or one-armed macroeconomic response. We get an unbalanced response in turn. Therefore, I think fiscal policy has to play a role, particularly a role in after a bursting of an asset bubble, to restore demand and to restore demand and investment. Now, with regard to fiscal policy, we should not allow this to be an opportunity for the supply side right to put out a new round of tax cuts, which they're already doing in some respects. We should use it to make a much more sound case that the best fiscal policy would be an increase in public investment spending, particularly beginning with public infrastructure spending, for three reasons. First, it's the best way to both crowd in investment and demand at the same time, which helps the economy recover, but helps stimulate investment. It creates jobs and income growth, therefore helping us put us on that path to a more optimal economic growth. And third, and most importantly, it can be targeted. Now, while the bursting of the housing bubble is going to have these generalized effects, if you noticed the map, the initial map of our presenter from the IMF, there are certain regions, high area regions, where you will have cascading effects and therefore depressing economic effects in local and community housing markets where you have a large number of foreclosures. And the report of a Global Insight for the Association of Mayors identified many of those areas. And Jamie Galbraith, I think, explained very well how this cascading effect can happen. One way of offsetting that is with targeted public infrastructure investment projects that can go in, increase demand for local housing, increase jobs, restore government revenues, etc.
Thank you very much. Joel Kotkin, who's well known, has authored a report which we're releasing today entitled Back to Basics, essentially a back to basics approach to thinking about these issues of pro-growth, public investment strategy. We were, again, together last night, and he was talking about what concerns him is thinking about America's next 100 million people. So, Joel Kotkin.
Thank you. One thing about going to Washington, it's always good for your sense of pessimism. It's always nice to return to the rest of the country.
No, optimism.
But I mean, actually, I think there's some really surprisingly optimistic things. I was mentioning to Cheryl that when I've written several pieces about infrastructure in places like the Wall Street Journal, the most positive response is not where I thought it would come, which would be so-called liberals, but actually from conservatives. That I actually think that in the broad middle and even on the right, there are many people at the grassroots level who would really support a back-to-basics public policy. They don't like the way we're spending public money, but they understand the need for roads, some of the things that Bernard was talking about, some changes in education. They just want it to be very much based and centered on the fundamentals. So, and I think one of the reasons for that is that we have to start thinking about the future, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about the longer term. United States, and I know this bothers some people to talk about, the United States is the only advanced industrial country with relatively healthy demographics, i.e. we're still having children. My friend Bill Fry from Brookings was speaking in Japan, and he said he was showing the numbers. The U.S. is considerably higher birth rate, and the Japanese audience said, "I don't understand. How do you have more children?" And I said, if that's the question you're asking, you've got more problems than I thought. But the long term is that in Western Europe and Japan, Korea, in the next 20 or 30 years, we'll be looking at about 30 to 35% of the population being over 65. U.S. will be about 15 to 20%. So we have this next generation, which could be an enormous source of strength for the United States as we compete with the various wheelchair societies. The problem is, are we ready to make that investment for our children, which our parents, and particularly the generation of my grandparents, were willing to make for their future? That's where I think it's a big question. Clearly, the things Bernard's talking about, the roads, the congestion. I have to say very often I'm driving along the the 5 freeway, Los Angeles, which is the leading industrial center of North America, and you're going along the 5, and you really think you're in a third world country. I mean, it is just, the roads are literally falling apart, and there are places that are even worse. On the education issue, I would link these a little bit, but in a different way. I don't think we have a problem with PhDs, and certainly not PhDs in English. What we're missing is basic skills. When I speak around the country, and this happened in Milwaukee on Wednesday, the biggest problem they talk about is basic skills. Welders, machinists, plumbers. We're not even creating the skills. And I'm particularly concerned, frankly, about the young men who are not going to college anymore, because the men are going much less than women, and have no real path of upward mobility at all. An infrastructure program would provide some opportunities, and an expanded export sector would provide some opportunities for those people. And then, of course, there's also the tech infrastructure. Anyone who's been to Australia or Korea knows that our broadband system is not exactly second to none. Bernard mentioned the fact that we have this model, and having done a lot of studies of history, the United States was actually quite good at this. This whole idea that we've always been this laissez-faire society. There's been aspects of it laissez-faire society, but we've actually invested heavily in turnpikes, canals. The financing mechanisms have been all over the place. They've been state, they've been local, they've been private, they've been federal. The railroads, of course, that was a lot through land grants. There was a tremendous growth of what some of us affectionately like to call sewer socialism. I was in Milwaukee being a famous case of that, where we invested in the basic infrastructure. Basically, as my friend, the former mayor of Houston, Bob Lanier, says, the job of the public sector is to provide the pathway for private business to travel. We sort of don't do that anymore. The public sector isn't really involved or concerned or focused on that issue. We did it with the interstate highways, the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and of course DARPA, which led to the internet. Now, what are we doing now? We're not doing enough. We're not doing close to enough. I do think there's a bipartisan nature to this support. I do think that a lot of people in the middle of the country, who maybe some of the people here in Washington think are some sort of lower form of life, but actually they're very aware of the fact that the roads aren't good and the airports are crowded and the kids aren't getting the basic skills. So I think there is a lot of support. I think there's also a growing fear in this country that if we don't address this situation, both by job creation, by building up the manufacturing base, and providing basic skills for both office workers and the factory and the warehouse sector, we will continue to have this increasingly bifurcated society where the people at the very top aren't affected by it. People who can take helicopters don't have to worry about traffic jams. And so I think that there is a lot of concern about those things on the national level. Cities, which is of course somewhat my specialty, I see where cities are investing money in convention centers and arts palaces, the subsidizing of hip, cool condos in downtown. By the way, that's going to be a huge catastrophe on the real estate front, which nobody talks about, because who's going to spend $700,000 for a condo in downtown St. Louis if they don't think they can flip it? I think there's this whole Disneyfication of the inner city. Meanwhile, the job growth has been falling off, I think is a big problem. We have extreme cases of this, and I talk a little bit about it. Take Cleveland. You get these stories. Cleveland's back. Well, they put the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which is beginning to fall apart. They can't even get the stars to show up at the induction, so they have to do it in New York. And Cleveland, of course, has one of the highest percentages of poor people in the United States. New Orleans, if that isn't something that proves that not investing in infrastructure can really screw you up, and yet they had plenty of money to build all sorts of convention center and other sort of ephemeral things, and it didn't exactly work very well. And Bernard would know from New York, the roads, the subways. I invite anyone to take the number 7 train through Astoria and into Queens. I'm doing a project on the future of the New York middle class, and it really does feel somewhat like something you would expect to see in India. I mean, it's just creaking, and you're just waiting for it to plummet over. And in my home state of California, or adopted home state of California, we used to spend 20% in the 1960s of our budget on infrastructure. We now spend 3%. And we're increasingly a very creaking economy that's increasingly bifurcated, and we're really living off what Pat Brown did 35 years ago. So in terms of the future, I think there is a growing consensus. I think once you get by the supply side ideologues and the and some of the people who are on the Democratic side who are born again budget balance first people, I think once you get beyond that, I think you'll find there's a lot of support for this. People understand, particularly in a recession, this creates jobs and opportunities. I think this emphasis would also help us begin to move, as my friends in North Dakota say, we need more machinists and less poets. I think we have to have increasingly a focus on the emerging middle and working class populations. What's going to happen particularly to the children of immigrants, those who are not going to go out and get PhDs from Harvard? What kind of life are they going to have? What kind of jobs are they going to do? So it's not just brain or brawn, it's really being able to do both. So basically I think that what we're looking at is the need for a major reform on the level that we've done historically in the past. It's not anti-American to have a public investment agenda. It is really what has made America what it is still today and what it needs to be in the future.
Thank you very much, Joel. Janet Kavinoky, besides her responsibilities with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce directing their transportation infrastructure activities, is also head of a labor business coalition called Americans for Transportation Mobility. She's been thinking about this, and as I said earlier, Tom Donahue, the president of the Chamber, has really been very active and written, I think, some very important op-eds looking at this fundamental issue of infrastructure as well. So Janet, welcome.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me. I think the first thing I want to say is we have to recognize that the U.S. still has the best infrastructure in the world. We have spent years of our history as our demographics have evolved, our economy has evolved, our country has grown, building that infrastructure. I think now one of the significant problems we have is that the pace of change of our economy is rapid. It's amazing to me. I sat yesterday in a session where people were describing to me how I should go dig my blogs, and I realized I'm still fairly young and I didn't know what it meant to dig a blog, and now I know just how fast things are moving. And yet the pace in which we plan and execute our infrastructure is glacial. So where the U.S. Chamber falls out on these things is frankly that we really are looking at a potential economic crisis because you have an economy that's growing even modestly at 2 or 3% a year. The capacity of our infrastructure is not growing at all. Now, granted, for a long time we had overcapacity in our roads, we had plenty of capacity in our air traffic control system, so things sailed along. And there were much other sexier things to put money into. I mean, it's always sexier to plant trees or to take care of education or anything. I always tell people anything where you can look at kids, you can look at cats and dogs and trees, you have great visuals will motivate people. They'll say, we can invest in these things, we're going to see benefits, isn't that wonderful? It tugs at your heartstrings. And frankly, asphalt does not tug at the heartstrings unless you're somebody like me who happens to really love infrastructure. So what's happened over time is we have underinvested in the maintenance of our existing infrastructure, and I think that's what you're seeing today in the road systems, in the transit systems, in New York, across the country, even in air traffic control systems. And all the while we've also neglected maintenance just so we can kind of keep things going and fill the potholes instead of really rebuilding what we need, we also have done some building of new projects. Very popular for members of Congress to go cut ribbons on new projects, but we have increasingly lacked a prioritization of where infrastructure dollars are being invested. We have started spreading the peanut butter. If you look at the Federal Aid Highway Program, which I think is a good example of this, instead of being about investing in strategic assets, like in 1956 when the Federal Aid Highway Program was created to build the interstate system and had a very specific purpose, we now collect user fees, gas taxes, from people who drive, and then we spread it out across the country as thinly as possible. And instead of investing in strategic assets the debate in Washington, at least, about federal dollars, and I think I've seen it a lot at the state level, is can I get back what I put in, instead of are we actually investing where we need to invest? I think in order to change this, there has to be an economic imperative. There also has to be a quality of life imperative, and those two things are linked. We have a public that is increasingly tolerant of delays and of congestion, and not necessarily demanding a lot of change. I've heard some people talk about it as the frog in boiling water sort of example of this. Instead of outrage about the fact that someone's commute is now an hour longer than it used to be, instead of outrage about having to drive in LA 2.5 hours to get from my brother's house in Lancaster, Palmdale down to LAX, people say, you know what, I'll just use my time better. And so they eat, put on some makeup, maybe they change clothes. We've actually seen pictures of this. They make phone calls, they use the internet. They say, you know what, I don't know if we can do anything about this. There is a pessimism, I think, about, well, it's just the way things are, it's just the way the congestion is, and we can't handle it. People sit on runways. Now, I think the air traffic control situation might be a little bit different because you're in a confined space with a lot of other people and you can't do all of those things and just pass the time, and then it gets really hot, and then you can't go to the bathroom, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we have an incredible tolerance right now as a public for just letting things go. And we'd much rather have instant gratification. I thought that the discussion this morning about the iPhone economy was very, very interesting. I said to some people last night, you know, we're in a place now where people would rather go out and buy on their credit card a great flat screen TV than they would replace their roof when the roof needs replacing. They'll go put a bucket under the leak, and then they'll go watch their flat screen TV. Well, I think we've done a lot of that with infrastructure. Here's where the problem comes in. We are the frog in that boiling water when it comes to, in particular, goods movement in this country. You have the 5 major sectors that make up the economy: agriculture and natural resources, retail, manufacturing, transportation itself as a sector of that economy that make up 84% of the economy, and they all rely on the efficient, reliable, cost-effective movement of goods. Agriculture and natural resources in particular, because of what they're selling in the commoditization of that, really rely on being able to get things out of this country to the rest of the world in an efficient way to be competitive. I don't think you're going to see a massive crisis along the scales of we talked about this morning, housing and in the credit markets, but what you will see is an eroding of the competitive advantage that business has been able to get through working around our infrastructure limitations. The fact that we have been able to create logistics system and supply chain management that say, okay, well, we know this is what infrastructure is, we're just going to work around it, has allowed us to virtually increase capacity. Well, at some point, that capacity is going to be the be-all, end-all of retarding that growth, holding those companies back. And in fact, the Chamber has just entered into a partnership with the RAND Corporation and their Supply Chain Policy Center and asked them to start looking at capacity at critical points in our transportation system, at ports, at borders, at the elements of our infrastructure that are really relied upon for an economic growth, and to tell us if there's a D-Day out there so that we can really hold that up to Congress and say, look, this is an economic issue. I think that what Joel has talked about is absolutely right, and this is certainly along the lines of what the Chamber has gone on, is we have to talk about, as a business community, the need for this country to maintain a commitment to the fundamentals. I think we've got to do that in 4 ways if we're going to lead towards change. Bernard, I happen to disagree with you. I think there isn't a widespread understanding of the need that's out there. People know that infrastructure is important, but they're not compelled to do anything about it. And so what we have to do is do the research, do the education we need to do to make sure people understand the need, to make sure there is that groundswell in the grassroots, so that Congress will actually take some action. Because we all understand, I think, what's going on. And we can call, and I, as the Chamber's chief lobbyist on transportation, can certainly go in and talk to members of Congress and say, you need to do something. We need to do something about air traffic control systems, waterways. We have to do something about roads. But it doesn't make a difference if their constituents don't call. And right now, their constituents aren't picking up the phone. We also have to, I think, we do have to encourage private investment in infrastructure, not just in roads and rails, but waterways. We have to look at the energy crisis that we have in this country. We have to look at the communications problems that are going to keep us competitive. And I think the next thing that we have to do is it really comes down to dollars and cents. And the Chamber is committed to facilitating a dialogue on where we're going to get the public investment from so that we can move forward addressing these issues and I think help the economy generally, help the regional economies that really drive this country.
Great. Thank you, Janet. We're not going to go to all of those people, but I did want to give Desmond an opportunity to just share any thoughts or concerns he has about whether there is a place for a fiscal approach given the picture you helped paint at the forefront of this panel.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there certainly is a role for fiscal policy. You know, in principle, I'd have nothing against fiscal policy. And in fact, I'd recall that in reaction to the bursting of the earlier bubble, you know, when we had the NASDAQ bubble bursting in 2001, part of the solution was a very large easing in monetary policy, but it was also accompanied by an easing on the fiscal policy side. If my memory serves me correctly, we started from a surplus situation that was 2 percentage points of GDP. We moved to a deficit of 2 percentage points of GDP. My concern right now about fiscal policy is that for whatever reason, we've squandered the ability to use fiscal policy in an aggressive way to deal with what's a serious problem. We're starting from a deficit situation right now. The deficit's bound to widen as the economy weakens. And more importantly, I'd say, is that the ticking time bomb of Social Security being bust and the Medicare being bust doesn't afford the United States the luxury of really stimulating the economy at a time of need with fiscal policy to the degree that we would. I would just add that my experience of busts is what we're talking about in the housing market is we're talking about losses in wealth, and what is going to go on in society is a debate as to how that wealth is, how those losses are spread around. My experience tells me, much as I don't like it, is that the taxpayer is going to be picking up that bill too. And you know, the kind of numbers we're talking about aren't small. So in short, you know, I think that there's not the room for fiscal policy. I'm not saying that you can't do anything about fiscal policy, but really where the solution to softening the blow of this bust, in my view, is really going to come from monetary policy, you know, in the simple sense about pumping a lot of liquidity into the system, and the more important part is making sure that the financial system works properly. Could I just make one other point? Just one other point. I don't think I've given sufficiently pessimistic a view of the world, but one point that I'm really concerned about is that if you look at the history of the last 5 years or so, that the two economies that were really providing support to the global economy were the United States and perhaps China. What is my concern right now is that as the dollar weakens, what needs to occur is that the rest of the world, that the countries like Japan and Europe need to be following, providing the aggregate demand that is going to be subtracted from the United States. And the signals that one gets, you know, when one hears the ECB talking in much the same way as I imagine the Bundesbank would have talked, you know, that the only thing that they can really focus on is the fact that inflation in the past is at 2.5%, you know, doesn't give me much hope that we're going to be preventing this, you know, turning into somewhat of a global slum.
We do know that you have your optimistic moments now and then. I would like to, but we've got just a little bit of time, so let me get some questions on the table, and then we can respond together with this.
I just wanted to, actually, the movement in the government deficit was much larger after the 2000 recession. I mean, Martin Wolf attributes it to 7% move. I think it was at least a 5 to 6% move. So in effect, we went from a surplus of 1 to 2% to close to a deficit of 5 to 6%, which suggests by that experience that in effect, we should be thinking about using fiscal policy proactively in any case, because the deficit is going to increase in any case. So making wise use of fiscal policy that will help prepare the ground for a recovery would be a better use of it rather than having a prolonged period of suboptimal economic growth, which would put us in worse position for fiscal expenditures in the future.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
my basic
Thank you. Bill
argument.
Breer?
Thank you. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. Just a couple of observations and then a question. One observation is that because of public infrastructure investment, about more than 50% of Japan's coastline is now concrete. Another observation is that every time it rains in Washington, billions of gallons of raw sewage go into our rivers. And you haven't discussed the sewage disposal problem, which I think is a huge infrastructure problem.
We did talk about sewer socialism.
In the United States. And of course, if you observe our metro, it is tremendously lacking in simple preventive maintenance over the years. The rails are getting wobbly and what have you, and that shouldn't happen. It doesn't happen in Japan, I might add. Yeah, but my question is, all of the infrastructure suggestions that have been made lend themselves to be described as pork. And I mean, infrastructure over the years in Japan, or certainly here, it largely a lot of it can be described as pork. What mechanism would you put in place to prioritize and reduce or render the pork into something more palatable?
Right. This is the bridges to nowhere point, which I think is very important. Joel, why don't you respond and Janet, real quickly?
Joel's looking at me.
But I'm going to beg for brevity.
Okay, go ahead.
You know, I think first of all, pork is in some cases, in part, a creation of the media. And after the last surface transportation bill was passed, because of the existence of the bridge to nowhere, people were led to believe that that entire bill, all $286.4 billion of it, was a bunch of bridges to nowhere. Now, I will tell you, that bridge to nowhere has become the burden of every transportation professional's existence, because we now have to fight this perception throughout the country that every time Congress passes one of these bills and it has a specific project in it, it's pork. There are certainly a certain number of those projects that I think we could argue whether they have federal investment or not. I do think some of what Congress has already put in place with the transparency requirements is very, very helpful, but the bottom line as we pass these bills is we have to have a strong national imperative about infrastructure and a goal. A lot of people talk right now about we need a new vision for transportation policy, and I'm really tired of hearing about the new vision. What we need is something that's very specific that ties the investments we're making with benefits, so people understand if you spend X on this, if you invest X, we're going to get Y. We had an interstate system that had that federal aid highway program very, very focused for years. As the interstate system grew near completion, it was like, well, we're collecting this money, so we're going to spread it out, and we're going to spread it out, we're going to spread it out. We need to stop spreading the peanut butter and start prioritizing. I think then you will be able to distinguish the pork from what the real priorities are.
Let me get a quick comment from
Yeah,
Joel.
there's just one specific thing that I, just from looking at certain policies, if you take a look at transit, a lot of the federal government says, well, we'll give you money to build a light rail system. Now, you may not need it, it may not be the right solution, but what we did one good thing that we did in California, at least in Los Angeles, is we said, give us the money and we'll spend it on a system that makes much more sense, which was what's called bus rapid transit. We're able to get the same effect for about a third the price. So I think sometimes if the federal government would say, we're going to give you X for mass transit, this region, and you spend it the way that makes the most sense. Now, not that the regions will always make the right decision, but right now they're consistently making the wrong decision because the federal government says, we'll pay for X, but we won't pay for Y. I think it has to be up to the regions, and then if the regions screw up, well, you know, that's their problem. But I think so I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people and said, well, how come you built this, you know, this system which carries no people, basically? You know, these empty trains, if you see them in St. Louis and Atlanta, where, you know, 80% of the time they're empty. They said, well, the federal government mandated that if we were going to take the money, it had to be spent this way. Different regions have different needs, and I think there should be more discretion given by the federal government, and I think that would at least take care of some of those problems.
Thank you. I'm going to take one last quick question because I'm running into a time infrastructure challenge myself, and several of our speakers need to move. But one last question. Yes, Alan Greenberg.
Thank you. It seems to me that
It's going to be a brief question.
yes, it's very brief. Sprawl is a big reason that our infrastructure costs have gone up quite a lot. A number of cities have lost population, and yet there's substantially more driving, and that leads to a lot of congestion. I want to know if anyone has any insights on how to tie investments to location decisions so that businesses and homes are located in ways that are conducive to serving them efficiently with our infrastructure investments.
Thank you. Good question on sprawl. I know this is Joel's favorite topic, so...
It's not my favorite topic. I think that a lot of this discussion is, first of all, cities are losing population because they're unsafe and the schools stink and they have terrible business climates. That's why people leave. I think if you decide, one of the great theories is, well, we won't build any more roads and then people will be forced to live in the inner city. You know, we're going to dragoon people into little boxes because that's what the new urbanists and the Greens want us to live in. Of course, they don't want to live that way. But what you find actually is probably more the case is once it becomes impossible to get into the center city by car, in most parts of the country, there are some exceptions like New York, but then people just stop going. If you look at the 1970s where the price of energy went way up, we didn't get a return to the city. We actually got more sprawl because it took so long to get into town. If you, so I think you really, the other thing about the whole question of sprawl, people who live in the outer suburbs, Ed Glazer at Harvard's done great studies on this, they actually drive less and spend less time getting to work than the people who live closer in. The longest commutes in America, by the way, are in New York and Chicago. Much worse than they are in Los Angeles, which may be somewhat of a surprise, and of course the media wouldn't quite realize it. So I think the issue is, how do you build the appropriate infrastructure in the right places? And I agree that we should try to bring the jobs to where the people live, but urban leaders are going to have to face the fact that if you do that, many more jobs will be in the suburbs than will be in the city, because already that's where the population is and where 92% of the growth in metropolitan areas has taken place since 2000.
Thank you. Recently, I had the privilege of having a breakfast meeting with a few other people with Nancy Pelosi, and I asked her about Bernard's efforts to focus on public infrastructure issues and a whole variety of points. And without getting into the questions of prognostication about where the economy is going, there is, I think, if you read Bernard Schwartz's paper and Cheryl Schweninger's paper, which again for the C-SPAN audience we will have on our website and the link, is that there are reasons to reinvent the country and to sort of look at this. And I asked her where she was on this, and she says she totally supports it. She supports moving into a capital budgeting approach, but she's still in favor of PAYGO. And just in terms of concluding this, before I invite Steve Cole, the president of the New American Foundation, to come offer just a quick concluding end to this, let me ask Bernard specifically, where do you see the tectonic dimensions of this going politically? And do you sense that the tension between PAYGO and thinking about public infrastructure investment is something that can be overcome?
PAYGO was a Republican invention that was adopted by the Democrats, and by adopting that from a political point of view, the Democrats have painted themselves into a corner. It means that you can't have any new initiative, irrespective of how valuable it is to your society and your constituency. You can't do it unless it's revenue neutral, meaning cut out some other worthwhile project or raise taxes, and that's just politically not a good thing to do today. I think the question that's raised, what do you do about this? Okay, so we agree that you need this, for any number of all the good reasons we heard. You really need the political will to do this. This is not an economic problem, nor is it an affordability problem. I agree with many of the things you put up, but I come up with a different conclusion. For example, I look at the Social Security crisis that was 4 years ago, something that was imminent on our doorsteps and something we would not be able to handle if you add it to the pension liabilities that are unrecorded, et cetera, as really a fiction of what happens in the Beltway. The fact is Social Security has been amended 30 times since, and it's probably the most successful social program we've ever had in order to take care of better requirements. Not only that, calculus is so important. When you think in terms of a businessman buying a machine that he needs, and it costs whatever it costs, but it's going to be amortized over 10 years, and he gets 18 years out of use of that machine, he thinks he's got a dividend for 8 years. The federal government, or rather the rhetoric here, says that a person, the human machine, who is calculated to be productive through 65, if he happens to work, he or she, to 75 or 80, that's a bad thing. What isn't a bad thing? The fact is it helps ameliorate the Social Security problem and builds our society in a much better way. So the calculus here is very important. So what do you need? You need a political will. All you need here are leaders who are going to say, we need this, like we need a good drinking water. It's something we're going to have. Like we need an army. Like we need an initiative on a national level. For whatever the reason is, we need it. And we have the capability to pay for it and the smarts to make sure that we don't build 3,000 bridges that go nowhere. If you look at a program like the Bridge to Nowhere and other like problems, wasteful problems, it probably represents 2 or 3% of the capital budget that was spent and authorized that year. Well, you tell me which one of you operates at 98% efficiency. And the perfect here is the enemy of the good. If we allow the investment in Bridge to Nowhere to defeat us, to immobilize us for doing what we have to do to keep this a constructive, competitive society, we're going to lose out at the end. It'll be our fault. And the historians will look back and say, what were those people doing 30 years ago? You have to act now. You have to motivate your representatives to do something about it. And with all due respect, the media has to understand that writing good things and affordable things about our society may not sell as many newspapers or web hits as bad news, but it's equally available for us if we want to reach out to it.
Thank you. Let me invite well-known of the New Yorker and the Washington Post and now President of New America Foundation, Steve Cole, to say a few closing words. Thank you.
At New America, we try to consider and where appropriate, pursue the unorthodox. That usually doesn't extend to offering welcoming remarks when it's time to say goodbye, but I apologize. I was at 7:15 circling above Syracuse in an Air Canada jet, and unlike the problem that Janet highlighted, I was not suffering from a deficit of outrage about the wait for an air traffic control vector on the East Coast. But I'm very glad to have been here throughout this morning. I learned quite a lot. I hope you did as well. I just wanted, in saying goodbye, to emphasize that this event is not a one-off or isolated body of work for us, but part of a continuing body of work that includes two things I just wanted to mention by way of inviting your continued participation and involvement. One is New America has a very important California presence. The laboratory of democracy is about to become a laboratory of the credit crisis. Our office in Sacramento is a very short drive from vast empty housing stock. And in Los Angeles, the rates of reset and default over the next 6 or 12 months are likely to be acute. And the California state government is going to wrestle very early on with some of the policy formulations, possibilities, and debates that we heard on the first panel. Those of you who are researching and involved in this, I'd urge you to look to California, and if New America can be helpful to you, please take advantage of us. The second thing I wanted to mention is that another important body of work that New America is engaged in now flies under the banner of the Next Social Contract, which is an attempt to synthesize our work in domestic policy, and to wrestle with the obligations of the public and private sectors. And there's an important event on Monday, December 3rd at the Mayflower between 9 and 3. You're all welcome to come and register in the morning. I think you'd find it as valuable as this. And then finally, I'd just like to thank everybody, my colleagues at New America, who worked so hard to put this on, Samir in particular, and Patrick Doherty and Sam Sherrard. But if this morning was valuable, and the panelists, of course, my old friend Joel, I haven't seen in 25 years, and the earlier panel, they were just terrific. But if this was valuable to you at all, it was because of the extraordinary efforts of one person who worked unbelievably hard to make this successful, and that was our moderator, Steve Clemons. So I'd like to end just by thanking him, and thank you.
Thank you all.
That's it.